Okay, so I've got the recording on now. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you all had a great weekend. So today, our class is going to be split into two parts. The first half, I'm going to talk about technology guide, specifically focusing on hardware. So this is the first technology guide that's found in the back of the book. So if you have the book, it's going to be towards the end there. Got a lot of papers in mine, apparently. But the technology guides, they're pretty short. They kind of go through some things that you'll run into from a managerial perspective. And this is what today's lesson is really going to be about. And then the second half, you'll have the opportunity to ask any questions that you'd like regarding anything for the exam. Really any question at all. I'm not going to specifically limit it to that, although I assume that most people will ask questions regarding the exam. Before we do that, though, I do want to remind everyone a couple due dates. So today, there are a couple things that are going to be due. If you did not attend last Friday's class, make sure that you've submitted the 1 to 2 paragraph. I sent out a couple emails about that just to make sure that you get credit for the group assignment that we had. And then also, the quizzes for Unit 1 are due today, so make sure that you submit them by the deadline. I don't accept late work, so it's make sure that you do it so you don't get a 0. But it shouldn't be too bad for either of those. Of course, tomorrow you'll have the exam too, so make sure you do that as well. Any questions before we begin? Well, I certainly do encourage everyone to stay on top of the deadlines. But, speaking of deadlines, actually, this isn't speaking of it at all, to be honest with you, but let's go ahead and talk about hardware. So, this lesson will specifically focus on a lot of the history of hardware devices, some of the different types of hardware components that you'll run into, some different form factors of hardware devices, as well as cover some managerial issues that you may face. So, of course, with hardware, it could come in a lot of different shapes and sizes and have a lot of different purposes. Some of the more common ones could be something like a smartphone, where it fits in your pocket easily. It could do a lot of basic computing. And of course, if you want to move up in size a little bit, you could have a tablet device. But if you want to have a little bit more functionality, you may find that a laptop provides you with more things it can do, more capabilities. And then, of course, a desktop is going to be a very stationary object and can have a little bit more power sometimes than a laptop. So those are the basic types. Of course, cost can vary. You can certainly find very inexpensive tablet. You can find an inexpensive smartphone. You could also find a very expensive tablet, a very expensive smartphone. So there's no real rule of thumb for things like the cost of these. But in general, it's just going to be a difference in their size and what their typical purpose is. So I wouldn't ask a question about which one of these is cheapest, because you can't answer that. You can't say that a laptop's always cheaper than a desktop or vice versa. Can't say it. So I wouldn't ask a question like that. I would instead ask a question relating to, maybe the relative size, maybe the typical purpose, stuff like that. Let's talk about how you actually get these, tell the hardware what to do, basically. Well, you have input devices, and these allow you to basically communicate with whatever you're using. So the most basic level, we have a mouse. We can move our cursor around the screen. Of course, if we don't have a mouse, maybe we have a touch screen. We simply click on the screen. Those are, of course, some basic ways to input. We could also use keyboard. Very common on a lot of laptops and desktops. Of course, we also have virtual keyboards on tablets, stuff like that. Of course, we could also use voice input sometimes. If we're on a gaming console, maybe we want to use like an analog joystick or some sort of flight simulator, something like that. But really, there's a lot of different types of input devices, and the whole concept behind these is that they allow us to interface with a device. Of course, the flip side of that is that the devices also want to provide us with information. And they could do this in a lot of different ways. They could do this with, physical output via printer, maybe a 3D printer, maybe a virtual reality headset could be considered real output. It could also be considered kind of not real output. I guess it's kind of in the name there. But certainly that's what we'd see. And, we'd also have the ability to see things on a screen of some sort, hear audio, of course, if we're doing music, or, of course, right now, hopefully you hear my audio. If not, we just wasted, 5 minutes of time, but that's okay. I'm sure everyone hears me. So now we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about the different components of hardware. So, of course, this isn't going to be all-inclusive. We could be here all day if we wanted to cover every single hardware component, but we're going to cover the basics. So the most basic level, you have a processor. And the whole role of a processor is to do most of the processing for whatever system you're on. It's not going to do 100%. You may still have a graphics processor that handles a lot of the graphics processing tasks. But in most part, the processor is going to do any sort of calculations that are going to be associated with it. And, throughout the process of running the processor, you may have some information you need to store in terms of short-term storage. So, for example, if you're building a spreadsheet, you're doing calculations, you're going to be running the calculation on the processor, but you have to have somewhere to store them in the meantime. And a lot of times that's going to be done on something called random access memory, which is basically just a component that allows for rapid short-term storage of information. It's going to be very short-term, because as soon as you turn off the system, anything on memory is going to be gone, basically. It's not going to be resilient to any sort of loss of power. Now, there are certain types of random access memory that that's not true for, but we're certainly not going to go to that level for this class. I mean, that's a very advanced concept, and those types of memory are not what you're likely to encounter in a professional environment. Of course, if you want to have longer-term storage, you'd use either a hard drive or a solid-state drive. A hard drive, of course, we have spinning components. They generate a lot of heat, and they can be less expensive per gigabyte than maybe a solid-state drive, which generate less heat, but it'd be faster and typically more reliable because there's no moving parts inside of a solid-state drive. So, the price per gigabyte is going to be a little bit higher on a solid-state drive. It is decreasing, but hard drives right now allow us to get larger amounts of capacity for a lower price. And, of course, all this kind of connects together with a motherboard. We have the different ports on the motherboard. Right here in the center, it's where the processor would go. We have these different slots right here. It looks like we have some PCIe slots as well. Those, of course, would allow us to put in, internal expansion cards of some sort, maybe a graphics card, maybe a special sort of network interface card, whatever we wanted to do, we could. Down towards the bottom is where the RAM would go. And it looks like over here we have our SATA ports for the hard drives to interface with. And it looks like this might even be an M.2 drive for maybe some additional solid-state storage. We've got a lot of options on this motherboard. Okay, I also want to discuss workstation versus a PC. So on the left here, I have a workstation. On the right, I have a typical personal computer. These are both from the same company. They're both made by Dell. The difference is that with a workstation, it's going to be a lot more geared towards reliability. And what I mean by that is that the components that are within here are going to be enterprise class. They're going to be technically server grade. So you'll have a server grade processor, you'll have error correcting memory, and you'll have several other things that distinguish it from the traditional Office PC on the right here. It's going to come with a higher price tag, of course, but it will allow you to do things like, advanced statistical calculations overnight, or, do a render farm situation, whatever you want to do. It's going to be great to allow an individual to have that sort of power. So that's the main distinction here. They can both technically do the same thing, but in most professional environments where you're doing those sorts of long repeated calculations, you're going to opt for the workstation over a traditional PC for the reliability aspect. Of course, if you wanted to be in a larger organization, you probably have a server rack of some sort. So it looks like right here we have about 5 different server racks. I can't count. That's 6 server racks. We'll ignore the fact that I can't count to 6. But yeah, certainly. So what we see here is we see a lot of individual servers. So on this server rack in particular, the second from the left, we see a large amount of servers on there. It looks like I'm not going to try to count them this time, but we certainly have a large amount. And servers are kind of unique in that they're sized out by what's called a U. So it stands for unit. So each U is actually going to be 1.75 inches tall. So we have several 1U servers, and then we could also have a 2U. Looks like right here, kind of toward the bottom, there's actually a 2U, which would be 1.75 times 2, which is 3.5 inches. Whoops, didn't mean to click there. And the whole concept behind this is that we can basically purchase an entire server. We can upgrade it to some extent, although we'll be somewhat limited there. So, as we move around, we'd have to basically, let's say we got new employees or whatever, we'd have to purchase all new servers to kind of accommodate them. And that could be quite costly. One way to address this would be with a blade server. So blade servers are very expensive. A lot of times a blade server full of blades, the chassis full of blades rather, could run you about 50 to 100,000 easily. But the advantage of them is that you could purchase what you need more effectively. So basically, you could purchase a blade. Maybe right now you only have enough capacity to fill it with maybe half of its capacity. So if you purchase a chassis, probably run you somewhere in the ballpark at 10 to 20 grand. Then you'd be able to put in, maybe 10 to 20 grand worth of blades within them. So each of these individual components right here is a blade, typically has some RAM and a processor. And as you grow or shrink, you can add or remove the blades. And that's one way to address changes that happen if you're going to host the hardware yourself. So just kind of wrap things up, talking about some different managerial issues. With hardware, there could be a lot of security, particularly physical security. So it's very important to ensure that your hardware is physically secure. And you'd want to make sure that you can lock it down if you need to. Certainly use physical locks as well. We'll cover this more in information security. But for now, just make sure that your hardware is physically secure. Depending on what you're buying as well, you'd also want to make sure that you have space for it. Looking back at this server room right here, it takes a lot of space. It's very expensive to have that. You look at this raised floor right here. That's very expensive to install. So there's a lot of concerns there. You want to also ensure that you own the equipment. You could certainly purchase, particularly Office PCs, very common to do, using a lease program. But the downside of that is that you don't own the hardware at the end of the lease. So basically every 3 to 5 years, you basically starting from scratch, So it's one way to think about it. But there's also, of course, tax advantages to using leases, which is why they're common. So you've got a lot of options there for how you actually want to own the equipment. Then, of course, upgrading. Certain devices are going to be more prone to upgrading. Probably one of the most upgradable would be if you purchase a blade chassis. You could upgrade it quite a few times. So you've got a lot of options there. Now, of course, we're not going to go too far in depth on the test, so don't worry about anything like that on the exam. But I just want to make sure that you're exposed to this from a managerial perspective. Form factors, you just want to pick whichever one is most logical. You want to consider your budget. You want to consider what you're going to be doing, how you're going to want to be doing it, what space it's going to go in, all that sort of stuff. So that's basically it for the technology guide. I try to keep these pretty quick, just kind of cover these from a managerial perspective. Any questions about the technology guide? This will be covered on the first exam, by the way. But it'll be a very high level. It's not going to be like I'm going to ask you, for anything specific. I might show you a picture of a RAM component, and you might tell me this is a RAM stick. You might have a question like that. But you're certainly not going to have a question, or I'm asking you about compatibilities between processors and motherboards or anything like that. So any questions? Does that make sense to everyone? Does everyone kind of understand, what we talked about? Okay. So that takes us back to the unit 1 here. So that basically wraps up the whole unit. So now that's all I had for today. Certainly happy to field any questions at all about any of the terms, anything from class, anything like that. Like I said, feel free to unmute your mic and ask me any questions. You can ask questions about the format of the test. You can ask questions about anything at all.
Could you go over some examples of ERP again, if that's all right?
Sure can. So what do you mean by go over some examples? Like what's included within it, what it is, what it does? What exactly do you want?
Kind of what it is and what's included mostly.
Yeah, sure thing. So let me pull up those slides and get to it. But while I'm pulling it up, I just want to kind of go ahead and talk about this a little bit. So basically, the whole concept of an ERP is that we want to unify a company, and we want to have it be have all the data within one place. And it's one of the ways we do that is with a system that basically tracks all the different, or at least a lot of the functional units within the organization. So, we have all that sort of data all within one place. We're able to cross-reference it. It's going to remove a lot of the information silos where one function unit has access to information that no one else does. And we want to avoid that. So, if we look back, fifth slide of the chapter 1, we have the different components. We have finance and accounting. We have information about what's being spent within the organization. We have information about what our budgets are, what are in our accounts, how much cash we have on hand. That's all included. We have information about what jobs we have, what jobs we need, who's being paid what. We have information about our primary business activity. We have supply chain information in there, what's coming in, what's going out. How can we, use that data to be more effective? That's something we could answer with this. Project management as well. What are special projects that we have going on in the organization? And then as well, customer relationship management. Who are our customers? What do they buy? When do they buy it? All that could be answered with an ERP. So that's basically some of the things there. Of course, we can also talk about the commoditization of ERPs. So if an ERP is commoditized, it means that anyone can purchase it. It's going to be a product, something like SAS, PeopleSoft. There's probably some other examples. Can't think of them off the top of my head. Oracle has some as well. I think Oracle's owned by, or I think that PeopleSoft is owned by Oracle. But, that's neither here nor there. I mean, certainly, if we have a commoditized product, it means anyone can go out and purchase it. And with that in mind, it means it's going to be very hard to achieve an advantage through that. So, great question. Does that answer your question? Did I cover too much, too little?
No, that was perfect. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Any other questions? I'm happy to field any questions at all.
So with the test, there are not going to be any discussions or fill in the blanks or anything. It'll all be multiple choice.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. The entire test will be in multiple choice format.
Well, we have, okay, so how many questions are there and what's the time limit we have to complete it all together?
I'm pretty sure that I put 56 questions on it. Don't hold me to 56 exactly, but I'm pretty sure there's 56 questions because that gives you 1:20 per question. And that should be enough time to, if you have maybe 20% of the questions you're not sure about, you have time to look those up. But you wouldn't have time to look up the entire exam. It's not going to be I'll go ahead and tell you, it's not going to be an exam where you can Google the question and find, the Quizlet for it. That can't happen. I make my own test questions. So, somewhere in between that, you'll be able to look up 10 to 20%, but then a lot of it you should know. Certainly I think that's a fair way to do an online exam, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Does that help answer that question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other questions about the format or anything like that?
You can't stop and you can't take it and then stop and then when you get back on let it resume. You have to take it at you can't, once you start it, you have to finish it. Yeah,
exactly. So you get one attempt, and exactly like Jordan just said, once you begin the exam, you have 75 minutes before you submit it. If you wanted to and you had the time, you could certainly run and use the restroom or whatever. But I'd certainly recommend that you try to not do that. I mean, just make sure you have 75 minutes where you can sit down and hammer it out and get it submitted. That'd be my recommendation.
Oh, okay.
All right. Who's got another question? So again, any of these terms, it's pretty much 100% guarantee will be on the test. I'm not going to say 100%, but it's pretty close. So I'll go ahead and tell you one that I forgot to cover, and that's my bad, is the whole concept of fiduciary duty. So, when we talk about fiduciary duty, that's saying that the shareholders basically demand that the executives and that the company as a whole is going to act in the interest of the shareholders and the owners. So regarding that, you do want to make sure that anything that you do is going to be profitable, and it will aid in making the company sustainable in terms of profitability in particular. If your company's not profitable, it's not going to be sustainable from a financial standpoint. So this is purely concerned with the financial stability of the company and ensuring that it's going to be profitable. So that's something I forgot to cover. I apologize for that, but certainly do want to make sure that you all get all the other material. I'm pretty sure I covered everything else, though, but certainly I'm happy to address anything else.
Are there any topics that are like more heavily covered on the test than others?
That's a good question. Yeah, there's about 10 or 11 questions for email. I remember making those. Those should be pretty easy. Most people usually get those without any issue. But beyond that, nothing jumps out at me. Like I said, I think looks like there's about 70 terms on here. I think that they're pretty evenly distributed, I would say.
In the past, other people that have taken this course, how did they typically do on the first test?
The tests usually have an average of around 70. But now keep in mind, that's for a lecture section. And I also usually end up curving it. And with bonus points, the average ends up being about 80. In a summer section, it's usually about 80. With bonus points in a curve, usually ends up being an average about 90. Just because, it's a smaller section. Maybe people a little bit more focused on, such a shorter delivery time. Whatever the case may be, people tend to do pretty well on it, I would say. Each test relatively has the same average. Maybe there would be a couple points difference, but not more than 2 or 3 points different between the exams. I would certainly make sure that, when you're going through your studying, that you know what each of these terms on here are. You remember how I talked about it in the lecture. You also remember, what it is, how it applies to business, maybe some examples of it, stuff like that. If you know that, you'll do fine. If there's any terms on this list right here that you're not familiar with, make sure that you ask. This is the perfect time to do it. Doesn't get much better time than this. But, like I say, certainly if you know all these terms, you'll do fine. Any other questions?
And what's that SaaS?
That's going to be software as a service. So that would be a situation where we're purchasing the use of software, but we're not hosting it ourselves. Instead, we're letting a third-party vendor host it for us. So we're going to access it often through a web browser, but it doesn't have to be through a web browser. And it's going to allow us to be to have the ability, rather, to really kind of reduce our upfront cost of having a system. So if we had a system where we didn't have any sort of hardware, we don't have to have that upfront cost. Instead, we're going to pay maybe monthly, maybe annually. We're going to pay a license to use it instead. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Happy to field any questions at all. Well, let me ask you guys a question. You guys like the fact that you have access to all the terms? Is that helpful?
Yeah, but there's if we want to see the definition to them, we'll have to go to the lectures, right?
Yeah. Lectures, notes, textbook, online. You could ask right now if you want to know any of them as well.
How do you get to the textbook?
What do you mean? How do you get to the textbook?
Is something you have to purchase on your own, or is it included on a bookshelf in Canvas or something?
You'd have to purchase it. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You might be able to get a free trial through Canvas. I'm not sure if that's working or not. The Wiley Plus, you might get a 1 or 2 week free trial. Since the course is only 3 weeks, that'd probably work out pretty well, I imagine. But I'm not sure about that. But yeah, typically you'd purchase it.
Okay.
Any other questions?
I wanted to see what the direct and indirect feedback referred to.
Yeah, great question. So we have direct feedback. It means that it's feedback that's solicited directly from customers. So there's no intermediary that's involved in the collection or dissemination of this information. So for example, let's say that I ask you a question directly. I say, what do you think of my class? And I'm not actually asking you that, but that would be an example of me seeking direct feedback. But instead, let's say that I sent out a survey to the university, and the university was involved in this. Then it'd be more indirect feedback because it's not me asking you directly. So another example of common direct feedback would be like social media, for example. Because if you go on a company's social media page and you say, I really love your products, they're great, that's direct feedback. You could also do the inverse and say, I really hate your products, they stink. That'd be direct feedback as well. However, if a third party like Rasmussen contacted you and you said, and they ask you a question rather about, what do you think of this industry as a whole? That'd be indirect feedback because it's not directly associated with the party in question. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that sounds good. I was just making sure it was like what aspect of business it referred to.
Yeah, so the main difference is like direct feedback is either you're providing directly to the company or the company's directly asking you. Indirect feedback is, you going through some sort of third party. Could also be like, you're not even necessarily using any sort of feedback that's relevant at all. You could be using maybe CPI measures, corporate or just economic measures on the whole. So, good question. Any other questions?
I just had one more. Edwards Deming or whatever his last name is. I might have said that wrong. But he was he the founder of continual improvement?
I wouldn't say he's the founder of it, but he certainly is the biggest name associated with it.
So,
In terms of, implementing Kaizen, a lot of the Japanese firms in the 70s and 80s had him as a consultant actually provide a lot of feedback for how to implement a lot of continual improvement. The funny thing is, I made the test in Canvas. I don't actually remember asking a question about him, but he's on there, so I guess maybe I do. I'm pretty sure I don't, though. I guess it's not that funny to people taking the test. But no, certainly, I'm pretty sure that the terms, I would say at least 95% of the terms on the exam are on that list. So, any other questions?
Are there any true or false?
There'll be a couple true-false questions. Basically, true-false can be a little tricky, but I try to make sure that I highlight and this goes for the entire exam, really. If there's a single word that changes the meaning of what I'm asking, I make sure to highlight it. Like I could ask a question like, which of the following are not examples of, whatever. I'm going to make sure that I bold the word not, just so that I'm not, trying to be tricky. Because I don't want to be tricky. I want to make sure that I'm testing, your knowledge of the material as opposed to how tricky I am. And I did promise I'd give you all a question, didn't I? What I believe to be the hardest question. I think I said that, didn't I? Well, let me be a man of my word here and pull up the exam and tell you which question I think is hardest. I don't remember off the top of my head, to be honest with you all. Yeah, while I'm doing this, does anyone have any other questions? Certainly feel free to ask me any questions at all. Yeah, sorry guys, I'm having to read through this. I should have written it down. That'd have been the smart thing for me to do, but I never claimed to be too smart, Okay, I don't know if this is the hardest question, but it's a moderately challenging question. So I ask, from the perspective of fiduciary duty, what advantage does innovation have? One of the choices is going to be provide the firm with technological innovations. One of the options is going to be provide competitive advantage to the firm. One of the options is going to be provide the firm with increased prestige. And then one of the options is going to be provides increased profitability. So, in this question, I did bold the words fiduciary duty because that does greatly change the answer to the question. So if we're talking about fiduciary duty, we're going to make sure that we're going to think about what's going to be most profitable, what's going to be most sustainable to the company long term. So with that in mind, an innovation would allow us to have increased profitability. So the answer to that one's going to be provides the firm with increased profitability. That could be a somewhat tricky question, particularly if you don't know what fiduciary duty is. And that's, like I said, that's probably one of the trickier questions on the exam.
What was the answer again?
So the answer is to provide increased profitability. And like I say, that's purely because that first clause inside the sentence, from the perspective of fiduciary duty. If I ask from the perspective of, from a different perspective, maybe I'm looking at a impact of maybe, I don't know. But, depending on what the perspective is you're looking at, it's going to change the question a little bit there. Any other questions? Any topics on there that you want me to go over again or anything like that at all? And I don't believe that anyone's emailed me with any questions. I'll check. No, I don't see any emails in there, so. So, any questions at all? Well, guys, I got to be honest, that's really all I had planned today. It was, just to go over the first technology guide and also to address any questions from, exam 1, unit 1. So if you don't have any questions, certainly hope you all have a great day. I'm going to stick around for as long as there's anyone else here. But certainly, that's all I had. So. Yeah, feel free to ask any questions, though. All right, Cass, you got any questions? All right, it's just me, so I'm going to sign off. Hope you all have a great day.